The airport was alive with its usual symphony of footsteps, muted conversations, and the occasional call of an overhead announcement. Evelyn Harper moved through the terminal with the determined air of someone who had traveled more times than she cared to count. Her well-worn leather purse hung neatly over one arm, and her boarding pass was clutched tightly in the other hand. At 68, she had long mastered the art of efficiency in travel, knowing exactly how to navigate the chaos without getting caught in it. She reached her assigned seat 17B and paused, her eyes falling on the man seated next to the window. He was tall, his tailored blazer fitting neatly across broad shoulders, and his dark skin contrasted sharply with the white button-down shirt he wore. He was absorbed in the view outside, seemingly unaware of her presence. Evelyn's stomach tightened, and her throat prickled with a sudden, inexplicable tension. Without hesitation, she turned to the flight attendant, who stood nearby, helping another passenger with their luggage. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice clipped but quiet enough to avoid drawing attention. "I need to change seats." The young woman blinked in confusion, her cheerful expression faltering. "Is there a problem with your seat, ma'am?" Evelyn gestured discreetly toward the man in 17A. "I'd just prefer to sit somewhere else," she said, her tone soft but firm. The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes darting to the man, then back to Evelyn. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is full. There aren't any open seats available." Evelyn's grip on her boarding pass tightened. "Check again, please." Before the attendant could reply, the man turned, his expression calm as he regarded Evelyn with quiet curiosity. His gaze was steady, unhurried. Then, a faint smile softened his face, a kind of smile that carried no malice. "Only patience. If it makes you more comfortable, ma'am," he said in a low, measured voice. "I'm happy to switch seats." For a moment, the hum of the plane's engines seemed to fade into silence. Passengers within earshot turned their heads slightly. Not enough to seem rude but enough to catch the exchange. Evelyn felt their attention like a weight pressing against her. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself caught off guard by his composure. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger, but not this. His voice was steady, his words measured, free of any sharp edges. "Well," Evelyn began but faltered, unsure of what she meant to say. Her pride urged her to refuse his offer outright, but the attention of those around her kept her rooted in place. The man didn't wait for her answer. Rising from his seat, he began gathering his belongings, a briefcase, a tablet, and a neatly folded newspaper. He was tall, she noticed, taller than she had realized when he was seated. As he stepped into the aisle, he glanced at her once more, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity, and it certainly wasn't anger. If anything, it was understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the moment, as if he had seen it all before. "Enjoy your flight," he said simply before walking down the aisle to another seat. Evelyn sat down, adjusting her purse and scarf with deliberate care, trying to focus on the routine of settling in. She avoided meeting the eyes of the other passengers, though she could feel their gazes lingering, their silent judgments hanging in the air. The plane began to taxi, and Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her. The hum of the engines grew louder, but her thoughts were louder still. Her mind wandered, unbidden, back to her father's voice, a low drawl etched into the corners of her memory. "People need to know their place, Evelyn," he used to say. "It's not about hate, it's about order." She had never questioned those words. They had been her guide for most of her life. A framework that had kept her world small, predictable, and manageable. And yet, here she was, confronted by a man who hadn't fought her or challenged her but had simply moved with a grace that left her unsettled. As the plane lifted into the sky, Evelyn glanced back down the aisle. She could see him seated a few rows away, engaged in quiet conversation with his new seatmate. His posture was relaxed, his voice calm, a faint smile playing on his lips. Something about him unnerved her, not in the way she might have once explained to herself, as something foreign or threatening. No, it was the absence of any of those things. He was utterly unbothered, and that made her feel more exposed than she ever had before. Evelyn turned back to the window, the soft expanse of clouds stretching endlessly across the horizon, For the first time in years, she felt the faintest tremor of a question stirring in the corners of her mind, a question she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. The engines hummed steadily, the plane soaring forward, but Evelyn, sitting rigid in her seat, was far from certain where she was going. The plane hummed steadily, the faint vibration beneath Evelyn Harper's feet serving as a gentle reminder of their progress through the skies. She stared at the small, round window to her right. Though she wasn't really looking at the clouds, her mind had drifted somewhere else. Somewhere far from the present moment. She hadn't always been this way, Evelyn told herself. There had been a time, long ago, when she hadn't carried the weight of her father's voice in her chest. She had been a child then, full of questions and the kind of curiosity that often made grown-ups uncomfortable. Her father had been a man of strict principles. Robert Harper was not cruel, at least. Not in the way cruelty was typically measured. But his rules were ironclad. His expectations unwavering. He had been a man of the old world. A world that divided people neatly into categories he never questioned. Only enforced. Evelyn, he would say in that firm, paternal tone that left no room for argument. A person's place is decided long before you ever meet them. It's not for you to change it. As a girl, Evelyn didn't understand what that meant. She only knew that it was important. That it mattered to her father. And that it shaped the way their family lived. The Harpers had a tidy life in their small southern town. The people who came and went through their home were always like them. Respectable. Predictable. And safe. But life had a way of forcing itself into even the most carefully drawn lines. Evelyn remembered one summer evening when she was no older than 10. She had been playing in the yard when she saw her grandmother. A quiet woman with kind eyes. Standing at the fence line. Across the narrow stretch of grass was the neighbor's yard. And on the other side of the fence was a girl about Evelyn's age. She was laughing, holding out a bright red ball. Evelyn had wanted to play. The pull of the other child's laughter was stronger than her father's words. And she took a step toward the fence. "Grandma," she had said, her voice full of innocence. "Can I go over there?" Her grandmother knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Evelyn's face. "You could," she said gently, "but you might not like what happens after." Evelyn hadn't understood then. She had only felt the sting of confusion and rejection when her father called her inside a few minutes later. His disapproval radiating in silent waves. That night, he sat her down at the kitchen table and explained calmly, methodically, why some lines shouldn't be crossed. "It's not about hate," he had said, his large hand resting on hers. "It's about keeping things in their proper order. Do you understand, Evelyn?" She had nodded, though she didn't understand, not fully, but she wanted to please him. And so she had accepted his words without question. Over time, those words became the foundation of her beliefs, shaping the choices she made, the people she surrounded herself with, and the walls she built around her life. Now, decades later, sitting on this airplane thousands of feet above the earth, Evelyn felt the weight of those walls pressing against her. They had kept her safe. She thought, or perhaps they had simply kept her small. Her gaze drifted back down the aisle to where the man Marcus Williams, the flight attendant had called him, was seated. He was smiling, leaning slightly toward the older woman beside him as they spoke. Evelyn couldn't hear their conversation over the hum of the engines. But she caught the woman's laughter. Soft and genuine. There was something about him, Evelyn realized, that defied everything she thought she knew. He didn't fit the image her father's words had painted. He wasn't angry or threatening. He wasn't the caricature of defiance she had been taught to avoid. He was just a man. A man with a kind smile and an easy demeanor. The realization unsettled her. It wasn't that she hadn't met people like him before, of course. She had. But she had always kept them at a distance, refusing to see them as anything other than a reflection of the stereotypes she carried. Now, with nothing but time and the quiet of the cabin to distract her, she couldn't stop herself from seeing him as he truly was. Her thoughts turned inward, unbidden. What had she gained from those walls her father had built? Comfort, perhaps. Certainty. But at what cost? She thought of her late husband, Henry, a man who had shared her father's views. Their life together had been predictable. Yes. But also narrow. Their circle had been small. their world smaller still. Evelyn closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat. She felt the tightness in her chest again. The same tightness she had felt when she first saw Marcus sitting in her row. It wasn't anger. She realized not really. It was fear. A fear she had carried for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to live without it. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence. And Evelyn's eyes snapped open. She gripped the armrests tightly, her breath catching in her throat. The plane leveled out again. But her pulse remained quick. Her hands clammy. Down the aisle, she saw Marcus lean toward the nervous woman seated next to him. He spoke softly, his voice steady, and the woman nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Evelyn watched him, her chest tightening once more, not with fear this time, but with something closer to recognition. She had spent her life avoiding people like him, building walls to keep them out. But as she watched him, so at ease, so unaffected by her earlier rudeness, she couldn't help but wonder if those walls had been built for the wrong reasons. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a crack in the foundation of her beliefs. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a faint glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Doubt. The gentle rhythm of the plane's engines seemed to match the cadence of Evelyn Harper's thoughts, each one circling back to the man a few rows away. She told herself she wasn't watching him, but her gaze flicked toward him more often than she cared to admit. He sat easily, one leg crossed over the other, his movements deliberate but relaxed. His voice, though low, carried across the aisle now and then, as he engaged the older woman beside him in conversation. Evelyn tried to focus on her book, a novel she'd brought to pass the time. But the words blurred on the page. Her mind kept returning to Marcus Williams, to the earlier exchange, and to the uncomfortable silence that had followed. Her pride had urged her to hold her ground in that moment, to double down on the seat change and move on. But something about the way he had handled it, calm, gracious, without an ounce of bitterness, unsettled her. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't even seemed surprised. Instead, he had simply moved, as if he'd encountered that kind of situation so often that it no longer surprised him. It was that ease that gnawed at her now. How many times, she wondered, had he been made to feel unwelcome? How many times had he been forced to smooth things over? Not because it was fair, but because it was easier? She closed her book and sighed, the sound lost in the low murmur of the cabin. Her thoughts drifted back to another time, years ago, when she and her late husband, Henry, had attended a community event in their small town. It had been a summer evening, sticky with humidity, and the town square was bustling with families enjoying music and barbecue. Evelyn had been younger then, her hair still dark, her face unlined. She remembered standing with Henry near the refreshments table, sipping lemonade and making polite conversation. She remembered, too, the way Henry's jaw had tightened when a black family arrived, their young children laughing and chasing each other across the grass. "Don't they have their own events to go to?" he had muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. At the time, Evelyn had nodded in agreement, not because she felt the same, but because it was easier than challenging him. Henry had always been firm in his beliefs, and Evelyn had long ago learned that it was simpler to go along with him than to question the world they had built together. Now, sitting on this airplane decades later, she wondered what might have happened if she had spoken up that day. If she had asked him what, exactly, he was afraid of, but she hadn't. She had stayed silent, just as she had so many other times in her life. The plane jolted lightly, the turbulence startling Evelyn from her thoughts. She gripped the armrests instinctively, her breath quickening. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant reassured a nervous passenger, her tone light and practiced. Evelyn looked back down the aisle. Marcus had turned in his seat to face the woman beside him, his expression calm, his hands gesturing as he spoke. The older woman, who had looked uneasy earlier, now smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing. Evelyn couldn't hear what he was saying, but the effect was clear. He had a way of putting people at ease, of steadying them without effort. It was a quiet strength, the kind that spoke louder than any raised voice could. As she watched, she felt a faint stir of shame. She had been prepared to believe the worst about him without knowing a single thing about who he was. And yet, here he was, exuding a kindness and patience she hadn't earned. Evelyn thought about the assumptions she had carried with her all these years. Assumptions her father had taught her, that her husband had reinforced, and that she had never questioned. They had been the foundation of her world. But now, for the first time, she wondered what that foundation had cost her. Her gaze returned to Marcus. He was retrieving something from the overhead compartment, his briefcase in one hand. As he turned to sit back down, their eyes met briefly. He didn't look away, didn't flinch, just nodded slightly in acknowledgement. It was such a simple gesture, barely a moment, but Evelyn felt its weight. It was as if he saw her, really saw her, and was giving her the chance to be seen in return. The moment passed, and Marcus returned to his seat. Evelyn leaned back, the hum of the engines filling the silence between her thoughts. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest tug of curiosity, not just about Marcus, but about herself, about who she had been, who she was now, and who she still could be. She glanced down at the book in her lap, its pages still unread. Slowly, she closed it and set it aside. Maybe, she thought, it was time to start asking questions. The turbulence came again, stronger this time, a sharp jolt that sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Evelyn Harper gripped the armrests of her seat, her breath catching in her throat. Around her, the murmurs of passengers grew louder, a few gasps breaking through the quiet hum of the engines. A mother a few rows ahead bent over to comfort her young child, while others looked toward the flight attendants for reassurance. From her seat, Evelyn could see Marcus Williams rise. The plane swayed slightly, and he steadied himself with one hand on the overhead bin. He reached for his briefcase, which had slipped during the turbulence. But as he pulled it down, the latch gave way. Papers and a small notebook scattered into the aisle, sliding in different directions with the plane's gentle tilt. The sound of objects hitting the floor drew the attention of those nearby, including Evelyn. She watched him crouch, gathering his belongings quickly, his movements precise but unhurried. A moment later, she realized she was already reaching out before she even knew why. Her hand found the edge of his notebook, which had landed just beneath her seat. She picked it up and turned toward him as he looked up. Their eyes met, his expression one of quiet surprise. "Here," she said softly, holding it out to him. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice as calm and measured as ever. That same disarming smile flickered across his face, warm but not overly familiar. And for a fleeting second, Evelyn thought she might see something deeper behind it, something tired but resolute. She felt her cheeks flush as she quickly withdrew her hand, settling back into her seat. The moment passed without fanfare, and Marcus returned to his row, tucking his papers back into the briefcase and latching it firmly. But Evelyn's heart was still beating faster than usual, the small interaction lingering far longer than it should have. It wasn't the act itself that unsettled her. It was the ease with which it had happened, as though her instincts had momentarily outrun the rigid framework of her thoughts. She hadn't planned to help him. She hadn't even thought about it. She had simply acted, and that small, uncalculated gesture felt monumental in a way she couldn't explain. For the rest of the flight, Evelyn found herself replaying the scene in her mind. She thought of her father, of her husband, of the countless times she had silently upheld their views without question. What would they think if they had seen her? She wasn't sure if the idea unsettled her or freed her. Blank. Blank. Later, as the plane began its descent, Evelyn felt an unexpected heaviness settle over her. The conversation she had been avoiding all flight, the one with herself, was now unavoidable. She glanced again at Marcus, who was now seated quietly, his focus on the view outside the window. The sunlight hit his face at an angle, accentuating the calm lines of his expression. He looked peaceful, unbothered by the earlier turbulence, by the scattered papers, or by the way the flight had begun. But Evelyn knew better. She thought about the way he had handled her request to move seats with grace, with patience, with an understanding that made her wonder just how many times he had done the same for others. She thought about the notebook she had picked up, its worn leather edges suggesting years of use, and she found herself wondering what stories it held. Who was Marcus Williams? Really? And why did it matter to her so much? Her thoughts were interrupted by the captain's voice over the intercom, announcing their approach to the destination. Passengers began stirring, pulling jackets from overhead bins and straightening their seats. Evelyn stayed still, her hands folded in her lap, watching as Marcus helped the woman beside him retrieve her luggage. He did it without hesitation, without being asked, his demeanor as steady as it had been throughout the flight. As the plane landed and began taxiing to the gate, Evelyn felt a small but growing sense of urgency. She didn't want the flight to end this way, not with silence. She didn't know what she would say, but she knew she had to say something. When the plane came to a stop, and passengers began shuffling into the aisle, Evelyn stood, her movements deliberate. Marcus was a few rows ahead, waiting his turn to step into the aisle. Summoning her courage, she cleared her throat. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. He turned, surprised but polite, his eyes meeting hers. She hesitated, her words catching somewhere between her chest and her throat. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For earlier, I wasn't fair to you. And that wasn't right." There it was, out in the open, the words she hadn't allowed herself to think until now. Her pulse quickened as she waited for his response, her pride and vulnerability battling for dominance. Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice soft but steady. "That means a lot." Evelyn nodded back, her throat tight. It wasn't much, she thought, but it was a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, beginnings were enough. As they left the plane, Evelyn lingered near the baggage claim, watching Marcus from a distance as he chatted with another passenger. He was smiling again, that same easy smile, and Evelyn felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. It wasn't too late, she thought, to learn something new, to see the world differently, to see herself differently, and for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Evelyn Harper sat in her quiet kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the stillness. She cradled her coffee mug in both hands, its warmth seeping into her fingers. It had been a week since the flight, but the memory of it clung to her like a shadow. She had replayed the conversation with Marcus Williams over and over. His voice, steady and kind, seemed to echo in her thoughts at the oddest moments: when she folded laundry, when she stood in line at the grocery store, even as she watered the plants on her porch. It wasn't his words alone that stayed with her. It was his calm, his grace, and the quiet way he had accepted her apology without making her feel small. That morning, she had risen early and driven to the library for the first time in years. Something had compelled her, a restless curiosity she couldn't ignore. She didn't quite know what she was looking for as she wandered the aisles, but she found herself stopping in the history section, her fingers grazing the spines of books about the South, about segregation, about a world she had lived in but never truly understood. The librarian, a young woman with dark hair and a kind smile, had approached her. "Looking for anything in particular?" she had asked. Evelyn hesitated, glancing at the book in her hand. Its title, A Divided Past, felt heavier than it should. "Just curious," she had replied, her voice quieter than she intended. The librarian nodded, as if she understood more than Evelyn had said. "Let me know if you need help," she had offered before moving on. Back at home, Evelyn opened the book and began to read. The pages felt heavy in her hands, each one unfolding stories she had never been taught, stories about people who had lived lives parallel to hers but worlds apart. Stories of struggle, resilience, and quiet defiance. She thought of Marcus, of the way he had smiled at her. And she wondered what stories he carried. Had his life been shaped by the same barriers she had spent so long upholding? How many moments like the one on the plane had he endured? Blank. Blank. The next day, Evelyn took a walk through her neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. She had lived in this neighborhood for decades, but for the first time, she noticed its silences, the way people stuck to their own spaces, their own circles. She passed a park where children were playing, their laughter cutting through the stillness. A group of mothers stood nearby, chatting easily. Among them was a black woman, her face bright with laughter as she cradled a toddler in her arms. Evelyn paused, something tightening in her chest. She realized, with a pang of discomfort, that she had never spoken to that woman. Not once. They had crossed paths many times at the grocery store, at the local post office, but Evelyn had always kept her distance. The invisible wall between them built from years of habit. For a moment, she considered turning around, retreating into the familiar safety of her home. But something stopped her. A voice, faint but insistent, urged her forward. "Good morning," she said, her voice breaking the rhythm of their conversation. The group turned, surprised. The black woman smiled, a little cautiously. "Good morning," she replied. Evelyn hesitated, unsure what to say next. She felt awkward, exposed, like she was intruding on something she didn't fully understand. "I just wanted to say hello," she managed finally. "I've seen you around, but I don't think we've ever spoken." The woman's smile widened, the caution in her eyes softening. "I'm Angela," she said, shifting the toddler on her hip. "This is Mia." Evelyn nodded, her hands fidgeting slightly. "It's nice to meet you," she said, and for the first time in a long time, she meant it. Blank. Blank. That evening, Evelyn sat on her porch, the sun dipping low on the horizon. The day had left her feeling lighter, though she couldn't quite explain why. The conversation with Angela had been brief, but it had lingered in her mind, much like her interaction with Marcus. It had been simple, even ordinary, but for Evelyn, it felt extraordinary. She thought again of her father, of the lessons he had taught her, and of the walls those lessons had built around her life. For so long, she had believed those walls were there to protect her. But now, she was beginning to see them for what they were. Barriers. They had kept her safe. Yes. But they had also kept her separate. Separate from people, from understanding, and, perhaps, from a deeper kind of happiness. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the cool air wash over her. She thought of Marcus's words on the plane. "The world's full of second chances. Ma'am, we just have to be willing to take them." It wasn't an easy road. She realized, change rarely was, but for the first time, Evelyn felt she was ready to try. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Evelyn Harper stepped carefully along the path, her hands clasped in front of her. A small bouquet of white chrysanthemums held tightly. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth, and the distant sound of a bird's call only emphasized the stillness. She stopped in front of a modest headstone. The name engraved there, Margaret Harper, brought a flood of memories. Her grandmother's face came to her mind, framed by soft gray curls, her expression kind but firm. Margaret had been a quiet woman, not one to argue, but Evelyn remembered the warmth in her eyes when she spoke of fairness, of seeing people for who they truly were. Evelyn knelt slowly, brushing away the leaves that had gathered at the base of the stone. She placed the flowers down gently, arranging them with deliberate care. Her hands trembled slightly, and she let them rest in her lap as she sat back on her heels, the weight of her thoughts pressing against her chest. "I think I understand now," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "What you were trying to tell me all those years ago." Her grandmother's words had always been at odds with her father's teachings. Evelyn remembered their quiet conversations at the kitchen table, long after her father had gone to bed. Margaret had tried, in her gentle way, to plant seeds of a different kind of thinking, seeds of kindness, of understanding. But Evelyn had been too young, too loyal to her father, to let those seeds take root. "I spent so many years believing what I was told," Evelyn continued, her voice steady but low, "that people belonged in their own worlds, their own spaces. I didn't question it, I didn't challenge it. It was easier to go along." She paused, her gaze resting on the name before her. "But I see now how small that made my world. How much I've missed because of it." The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of her scarf. She closed her eyes and let the cool air wash over her, grounding her in the moment. For so long, she had resisted change, clung to the comfort of the familiar. But the events of the past few weeks, the flight, her interaction with Marcus Williams, Her small but significant conversation with Angela had opened a door she couldn't close. "I met someone," she said after a long silence. "On a plane. He showed me, not with words, but with his actions, that it's never too late to change. That it's never too late to see people for who they are." Evelyn thought of Marcus's calm demeanor. The way he had carried himself with quiet strength despite her initial behavior. She thought of Angela's warm smile and the easy way she had introduced herself. As if no barriers had ever existed between them. "I don't know where this road will lead," Evelyn admitted, her voice faltering slightly. "But I know I can't go back to the way things were. I don't want to." She stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight in her chest begin to lift. If only slightly, she turned and walked back toward her car. Her steps steady, her grip on the past loosening with each stride. Blank. Blank. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn made small but deliberate changes to her life. She began volunteering at the library, helping with a program that connected older adults with younger readers. She joined a local community group focused on fostering dialogue across different backgrounds. And, perhaps most significantly, she started to listen not just with her ears, but with her heart. One evening, as she sorted through old photographs in her living room, she came across a faded picture of her grandmother. Margaret was sitting on the porch, her hands folded in her lap, her smile serene. Evelyn traced the edges of the photograph, feeling the faintest stir of peace. "You were right," she whispered, as if her grandmother could hear her. "It's kindness that matters. Always has. Always will. Blank. Blank." Months later, Evelyn found herself walking through the same airport terminal where her journey with Marcus had begun. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she carried his words with her, tucked away like a talisman. "The world's full of second chances, ma'am. We just have to be willing to take them." Evelyn smiled faintly as she moved through the bustling crowd. She didn't feel like a different person. Not entirely, but she felt lighter, freer, as though the walls she had spent her life building were finally starting to come down. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Evelyn Harper wasn't afraid of what lay on the other side.